because of the tariffs, they say already having an impact on them. Well, tonight, the president going even further, saying Harley Davidson motorcycles should never be built in another country. And he's now threatening them with new taxes.
Harley Davidson, the iconic American motorcycle manufacturer with over a century of history embedded in the cultural DNA of the United States, found itself at a crossroads when CEO Jochen Zeitz made a landmark announcement. The company, long celebrated for its deep roots in American industry and craftsmanship, would be shutting down production in the United States and relocating its manufacturing operations abroad. This move was not merely a corporate strategy shift, but rather a seismic response to the latest political tremors sent across the global economic landscape. The decision came in the wake of the newly elected President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs imposed on key trade partners, a policy that unleashed immediate retaliatory measures from affected nations, triggering a trade war that would prove too costly for businesses operating within U.S. borders. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. For Harley Davidson, the decision was not driven by ideology or sudden global aspirations. Instead, it was a matter of survival. The company had already been grappling with a shifting market, aging domestic customers, a declining motorcycle culture among younger generations, and increasing global competition. Yet Harley Davidson had managed to stay afloat by leveraging its global presence and expanding into overseas markets. The imposition of new tariffs, however, disrupted this delicate balance. The cost of exporting motorcycles from the U.S. to international markets suddenly surged due to retaliatory tariffs from the European Union and other key regions. Simultaneously, importing necessary components for domestic assembly became more expensive, squeezing margins and threatening the long-term viability of manufacturing operations on American soil. At the core of the issue was a set of trade policies that fundamentally altered the economic equation for manufacturing in the United States. President Trump's administration had justified the imposition of tariffs as a protective measure designed to restore American manufacturing might and reduce trade deficits. However, in the case of Harley Davidson, the impact was the opposite. Rather than spurring domestic investment, the tariffs created a hostile environment for companies that relied on global supply chains and international customers. For Harley Davidson, with a significant percentage of its sales coming from Europe and Asia, the retaliatory tariffs meant that its motorcycles were now hundreds or even thousands of dollars more expensive in those markets. Price-sensitive consumers began turning to more competitively priced alternatives, eroding Harley's market share and brand dominance abroad. Zeitz and his executive team were thus faced with a painful reality. Continuing to manufacture in the United States under these conditions would not just reduce profits, it would render the business model unsustainable. Supply chain inefficiencies, ballooning costs, and the decreasing competitiveness of their products in key global markets painted a bleak picture. The company's plants, some of which had stood for decades as symbols of American industrial prowess, were now financial liabilities. Faced with the option of maintaining a nostalgic attachment to its heritage or securing its future in a hostile economic climate, Harley Davidson chose the latter. The company's plan to move production overseas was comprehensive. It wasn't a matter of simply outsourcing a few operations or seeking temporary tax shelters. It was a systemic pivot. Harley Davidson would be building new production facilities in countries with more favorable trade relationships and cost structures. This included regions in Southeast Asia, where demand for motorcycles remained strong and production costs were significantly lower. In doing so, the company could better serve growing markets without the added burden of tariffs and supply chain disruptions. Moreover, by producing closer to key international markets, Harley could offer more competitive pricing, reduce lead times, and tailor its offerings more precisely to local consumer preferences. This move marked a dramatic turning point, not just for Harley Davidson, but for American manufacturing at large. The departure of such a storied brand from its domestic production roots sent shockwaves through the industry and beyond. Harley Davidson had long been used as a symbol of rugged American independence and industrial pride. Its motorcycles were more than vehicles. They were cultural artifacts, embodiments of a lifestyle celebrated in film, music, and literature. The decision to move production overseas signaled that even this most American of companies could not withstand the economic pressures triggered by aggressive protectionist policies. Within the business community, Harley's decision was closely watched and widely discussed. It became an immediate case study in the consequences of broad-brush trade measures that failed to account for the interconnected realities of modern global commerce. Companies that depended on cross-border trade, both for sourcing parts and for selling finished products, were suddenly vulnerable. The Harley Davidson episode highlighted the thin line between economic nationalism and economic isolationism, a line that once crossed made domestic manufacturing less attractive rather than more. Harley Davidson's exit from U.S. manufacturing also had significant implications for its workforce. Thousands of jobs tied to its domestic factories were impacted. Skilled laborers, many of whom had worked for decades in Harley's iconic plants, were now facing uncertain futures. The ripple effect extended beyond the company to the communities that had grown up around its facilities, small towns and cities where Harley was not just an employer, but a pillar of the local economy. Suppliers, logistics providers, and local businesses that catered to Harley's employees all felt the sting of the company's departure. Despite these consequences, Harley Davidson was unequivocal in defending its decision. The company emphasized that its survival depended on global competitiveness. By shifting production overseas, Harley could mitigate the tariff impacts, preserve its international market share, and ensure its long-term financial health. Internally, the company viewed the move not as a betrayal of its roots, but as a necessary adaptation to an inhospitable economic climate created by policy decisions beyond its control. There were also branding implications. Harley Davidson had built much of its identity around the Made in America promise. This identity was now being reshaped, not abandoned, but redefined. The company leaned into its design legacy, American engineering, and brand storytelling, even as it diversified its manufacturing footprint. While some loyalists reacted with disappointment, Harley hoped that most customers would prioritize product quality, innovation, and riding experience over the geographical location of final assembly. The situation became a potent reminder of the complexities involved in global trade and the unintended consequences of seemingly straightforward policy shifts. While the Trump administration had aimed to stimulate domestic industry, the reality for companies like Harley Davidson was that the global marketplace could not simply be walled off without repercussions. The integration of supply chains, the mobility of capital, and the importance of foreign markets all made economic isolation a dangerous gamble. For Harley, the only way to remain competitive was to be nimble, even if that meant turning away from its foundational geography. Beyond the confines of Harley Davidson, the move served as a bellwether for other companies contemplating their futures in the U.S. manufacturing landscape. Executives across sectors, from automobiles to aerospace to consumer electronics, observed the unfolding events with growing unease. If a company as deeply American as Harley Davidson found the domestic business environment untenable under the weight of tariffs and trade retaliation, what did that mean for others with even more exposure to global volatility? Economists and trade experts weighed in, pointing to Harley Davidson as a prime example of the perils of modern protectionism. The company's decision became a case against using tariffs as a blunt instrument, especially when deployed without coordinated international strategy or industry-specific nuance. The retaliatory measures from trading partners were predictable and devastating. Instead of forcing a return to American manufacturing dominance, the tariffs forced American companies to accelerate their departure from the very soil they were meant to fortify. As Harley Davidson's overseas production plans unfolded, the company began laying the groundwork for a more globally distributed business model. This involved establishing new supplier relationships, hiring and training international staff, and adjusting logistical frameworks. The relocation was not without its own challenges. Regulatory hurdles, cultural differences, and the complexity of replicating the quality controls established in U.S. factories all posed risks. Still, for Harley, these were preferable to the certainty of declining competitiveness under the existing tariff regime, and others using it to critique the administration's trade strategy. Yet, amidst the political noise, the fundamental issue remained. American companies operating in global markets require a stable, predictable, and rational trade environment. Absent that, they will make decisions based on economics, not ideology. In moving its production overseas, Harley Davidson sent a message louder than any marketing campaign could deliver. It was a message about the fragility of tradition in the face of economic disruption, about the limits of patriotism when confronted with unsustainable cost structures, and about the adaptability required to survive in an increasingly competitive global economy. The decision was not taken lightly, but it was taken decisively. It signified a pivot from nostalgia to necessity, from legacy to longevity. While the production lines in American factories quieted, the company's engines still roared. Only now, they were being assembled thousands of miles away, in climates more favorable to modern commerce. Harley Davidson's essence, its rumble and attitude remained intact. But the reality behind the chrome and leather had shifted, reflecting a new era where even the most iconic American brands must go where the economics make sense. The closure of U.S. production facilities by Harley Davidson and the migration of its manufacturing to foreign shores stood as one of the most consequential corporate responses to a rapidly changing trade policy landscape. It was not a rebellion against America, but a reflection of what American businesses now face when economic strategy collides with political theater. The story of Harley's transformation is not just about motorcycles or manufacturing. It is about the shifting tectonics of global trade, the weight of political decisions, and the enduring challenge of balancing heritage with the hard arithmetic of survival. The shifting of Harley Davidson's manufacturing base overseas marked not merely a strategic realignment, but the unfolding of a broader narrative about what it now means to be a globally competitive American company. With production lines shuttered across the United States, the transition carried with it a deeper transformation, one that stretched beyond logistics and cost-cutting, and into the very identity of an institution once synonymous with domestic industry and Americana. The decision sparked a cultural reckoning within the brand. For over 100 years, Harley Davidson had represented more than just a product. It was a symbol. Its motorcycles were extensions of personal freedom, rebellion, and the uniquely American sense of the open road. From veterans returning home and finding solace on two wheels, to entire generations of riders forming subcultures around the Harley lifestyle, the brand occupied a unique emotional space. The departure from US-based manufacturing forced both the company and its loyal followers to reconcile with an uncomfortable question. Could Harley remain Harley if it was no longer made in America? To address this, the company launched an aggressive internal and external initiative to preserve its core identity, while simultaneously adapting to the requirements of a globalized production model. This included extensive investments in design innovation, brand storytelling, and rider experience, elements not tied to physical geography but rather to the enduring spirit of the brand. Harley's commitment to its design heritage became even more critical. Engineering teams doubled down on refining performance, enhancing the signature sound of the V-twin engine, and maintaining the visceral feel that had become inseparable from the Harley experience. In doing so, the company hoped to anchor its future not in where the bikes were assembled, but in how they made riders feel. Meanwhile, the operational execution of the move abroad began to unfold across multiple phases. The first step involved establishing wholly owned subsidiaries and joint ventures in countries where market demand was growing, and tariffs had previously limited Harley's competitiveness. India, Thailand, and Indonesia became primary focal points. These were markets with rapidly expanding middle classes, an appetite for premium motorbikes, and governments keen on attracting foreign direct investment. By positioning manufacturing closer to consumers in these areas, Harley was not only avoiding tariffs but also gaining the flexibility to tailor its offerings to regional tastes. Each market presented its own unique demands. In Southeast Asia, compact and agile bikes were preferred over the larger touring models that defined Harley's US lineup. Recognizing this, the company initiated the development of market-specific designs that retained the soul of the brand while adapting form to function. Engineers and product developers worked closely with local market analysts and consumer behavior specialists to ensure these models reflected cultural preferences, road conditions, and pricing expectations. This localization strategy marked a profound shift from the traditional one-size-fits-all model Harley had relied on in the past. Supply chain management also underwent a radical overhaul. Components that were once sourced from a well-established network of American suppliers were now diversified across multiple regions. The goal was to create redundancy, resilience, and efficiency. Factories in Asia began sourcing parts from neighboring countries, significantly cutting down on transportation costs and risks associated with cross-border dependencies. Simultaneously, Harley built regional logistics hubs to streamline distribution, reduce lead times, and enhance responsiveness to market demand. The company began to resemble a decentralized, adaptive organism, one no longer anchored to a single national economy but thriving across a constellation of interconnected global markets. With manufacturing and supply chains realigned, Harley Davidson embarked on a mission to reposition itself in the minds of international consumers. Historically, the brand had leaned heavily into American imagery, deserts, highways, and cowboy-inspired independence. In new markets, this strategy was refocused to emphasize aspirational freedom without cultural dissonance. Marketing campaigns were redesigned to reflect regional lifestyles. In India, for instance, Harley began telling stories that emphasized personal mobility, adventure, and self-expression within the context of Indian culture. In Indonesia, the narrative shifted to urban mobility fused with status and community. This recalibration of brand messaging was supported by a robust dealer network expansion. Harley made substantial investments in creating immersive showrooms and service centers that reflected the premium nature of the brand while offering local accessibility. These weren't merely retail spaces, but community hubs, venues for hosting rider events, training programs, and customer service workshops. The goal was to replicate the tribal sense of belonging that had always defined the Harley community in the US and export it to new riders around the world. One of the lesser discussed but critically important aspects of Harley's global pivot was its transformation into a learning organization. By moving into diverse cultural and economic contexts, the company was exposed to a wide spectrum of business practices, regulatory environments, and consumer expectations. Harley began to integrate this knowledge into its corporate DNA. Processes became more agile, decision-making more decentralized, and innovation more iterative. The company started adopting a philosophy of constant experimentation, where feedback loops from global markets informed everything from product development to pricing models. This new Harley Davidson was leaner, more attuned to global dynamics, and structurally insulated from the volatility of any one country's policies. Yet, this evolution wasn't without friction. In the United States, the political climate remained highly charged. Critics of the move accused the company of abandoning American workers and undermining national interests. Harley's leadership countered by emphasizing the inevitability of globalization and the necessity of adaptation in the face of economic headwinds. They argued that the true threat to American industry wasn't outsourcing, but intransigence, the refusal to evolve when confronted with an unworkable status quo. Beyond the ideological debate, there were tangible lessons emerging from Harley's transformation. One key takeaway was the importance of operational agility. In a world where trade policies could shift overnight, companies needed to build flexibility into every aspect of their operations, from sourcing and manufacturing to sales and distribution. Harley's strategic relocation was proof of concept that agility, not scale alone, was the new measure of industrial resilience. The company's financial strategy also reflected this new reality. Harley began to recalibrate its capital expenditures, prioritizing technology investments that enabled cross-functional collaboration across time zones and continents. Advanced manufacturing tools, predictive maintenance systems, and digital twin technologies were rolled out in the new overseas facilities. These tools didn't just boost efficiency. They allowed Harley to maintain high standards of quality control without the centralization that had previously defined its operations. As a result, the myth that offshoring automatically led to diminished product integrity was steadily dismantled. Meanwhile, Harley's relationships with governments in its new host countries began to deepen. In exchange for investment, job creation, and knowledge transfer, many local authorities provided incentives, tax breaks, infrastructure support, and streamlined regulatory processes. These mutually beneficial arrangements created an environment where Harley's success was aligned with local economic growth. In effect, Harley wasn't just operating in these countries. It was becoming part of their industrial fabric. In parallel, the company began to rethink its talent strategy. With a growing footprint abroad, Harley invested heavily in building a global workforce equipped with both technical expertise and cultural fluency. Training programs were launched to develop local leadership, and international exchange opportunities were created to foster knowledge sharing between old and new branches of the company. The goal was to eliminate the outdated notion of a headquarters brain and a periphery body. Instead, Harley sought to function as a network of interconnected, equally empowered units, a mosaic of capabilities and insights. As the company settled into its new global rhythm, it became clear that the decision to leave U.S. manufacturing behind had set off a cascade of organizational and strategic transformations. Harley Davidson had become a case study in the broader redefinition of what it meant to be an American company in the 21st century. It was no longer about where the factory stood, but about how the company performed, where it added value, and how it contributed to the broader ecosystem of global commerce. For policymakers and economists, the Harley-Davidson saga became an urgent data point in debates over trade, tariffs, and the role of government in shaping industrial outcomes. If protectionist policies inadvertently triggered the offshoring of one of the most iconic American brands, then what were the long-term implications for industries still clinging to outdated models of domestic advantage? The very tools meant to strengthen American industry had, in Harley's case, rendered it vulnerable. In a cruel twist, the effort to assert economic nationalism had instead accelerated the globalization of one of America's most revered manufacturers. Within the broader context of the U.S. economy, Harley's move raised questions about industrial policy, innovation, and workforce development. Could America remain competitive without manufacturing its most recognizable goods? Was it enough to be a designer, marketer, and innovator while letting production happen elsewhere? Or did the erosion of manufacturing capacity signal a deeper atrophy of national capabilities? For Harley Davidson, the move abroad didn't mean the end of its story. It signaled the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by geography, but by strategy. The company had traded its past for a stake in the future, choosing evolution over nostalgia. In doing so, it demonstrated that adaptability, not allegiance to borders, was the true hallmark of enduring corporate strength. The road ahead remains uncertain. Trade dynamics will continue to shift, political landscapes will keep evolving, consumer tastes will change. But Harley-Davidson, in taking the bold and controversial step to move abroad, positioned itself to respond to those changes not with panic but with readiness. It became a company no longer tethered to a singular identity, but shaped by the diverse, complex, and ever-changing nature of the world itself. And in that, it may have rediscovered a different kind of freedom. One not found on a specific stretch of highway, but in the ability to ride wherever the road leads. The transformation of Harley-Davidson from a quintessentially American manufacturer into a globalized enterprise, prompted by political and economic shifts, did more than restructure its operations. It signaled a critical inflection point in the evolution of multinational corporations navigating 21st century geopolitics. As Harley's relocation took form, the narrative extended well beyond the immediate headlines of plant closures and international expansion. It began to represent a deeper and more far-reaching reckoning between the values of national identity and the unforgiving logic of global economics. This reckoning became particularly stark in the domestic manufacturing landscape Harley left behind. Towns that had once thrived around Harley-Davidson's production facilities were suddenly left to reimagine their futures. Local economies that had benefited not just from direct employment, but from the entire ecosystem of support services, machine part suppliers, tool shops, caterers, logistics operators, were left scrambling. In many of these communities, Harley had served as a pillar institution, a source of civic pride and financial stability. Its departure created a vacuum, not just economically but culturally, severing a long-standing connection between the American worker and one of the country's most celebrated brands. This shift also laid bare the vulnerability of regions over-reliant on legacy manufacturing. The very infrastructure and workforce that once made these areas competitive were now seen as inflexible in the face of new global realities. The skills honed over decades, metal fabrication, precision assembly, industrial tooling, were no longer enough to shield communities from the broader tide of economic realignment. Harley's exit served as a wake-up call that loyalty, tradition, and brand patriotism were insufficient in a world governed by competitiveness, cost efficiency, and strategic positioning. Meanwhile, the company's expansion into new territories was accelerating. As Harley Davidson entrenched its operations in Southeast Asia and other growth markets, it discovered opportunities that had long been out of reach. In many of these countries, motorcycles weren't leisure products. They were primary modes of transport. The demand was enormous and constant. But more importantly, the consumer base was demographically different. Younger, more aspirational, and more technologically inclined. These new riders didn't have the same historical association with Harley Davidson that American consumers did, which offered the company both a challenge and an opportunity. It could build its image from the ground up, unburdened by expectations tied to a romanticized past. This required a new approach to design and engineering. Harley's iconic heavyweight cruisers, while revered in the US, were less practical in dense urban environments with congested roads and rising fuel prices. In response, the company committed resources to developing a new generation of lightweight, fuel-efficient, and tech-integrated motorcycles. These models featured digital dashboards, integrated navigation, smartphone connectivity, and even electric variants, a sharp departure from the mechanical simplicity that had once defined the Harley mystique. Engineering teams in Harley's new facilities began to evolve their development cycles with a more iterative, consumer-driven approach. Instead of adhering to a rigid top-down design philosophy originating in Milwaukee, the company instituted cross-border design committees that incorporated feedback from international dealers, urban planners, and customers. These voices influenced everything from chassis design and seat ergonomics to mobile app interfaces and rider assistance features. The outcome was a product lineup that reflected the needs of a broader global audience, with greater attention to inclusivity, environmental concerns, and affordability. At the same time, Harley Davidson began integrating data analytics into its core strategy. With its expanding global reach, the company had access to a massive and diverse data set. Rider habits, purchasing patterns, maintenance cycles, seasonal demand fluctuations, and even social media sentiment. Advanced machine learning models were developed to interpret this data, allowing Harley to predict market trends, optimize inventory distribution, and fine-tune its marketing messages with unprecedented precision. In its previous incarnation, Harley Davidson had functioned largely on instinct, legacy, and symbolic power. Now, it was transforming into a data-driven enterprise capable of engaging in real-time adjustments to everything from pricing to promotional strategy. It launched a digital transformation initiative that emphasized direct-to-consumer digital retailing, virtual customization tools, innovations that were difficult to implement under the older, more static manufacturing and distribution model rooted in domestic U.S. infrastructure. The new Harley Davidson began redefining its relationship with the customer. In the United States, this relationship had long revolved around dealership experiences, in-person events, and loyalty programs that appealed to older generations. But in the global market, particularly among younger consumers, digital-first engagement was essential. Harley developed mobile apps that allowed users to configure bikes, book test rides, engage with branded content, and even connect with local riding communities. It invested in augmented reality tools that allowed prospective buyers to place motorcycles in their own garages or view them in local terrain before making purchasing decisions. These immersive experiences replaced the traditional walk through the dealership model and provided new channels for connection and brand reinforcement. This digital evolution also informed Harley's approach to customer service. Instead of relying on call centers or in-store visits, the company adopted AI-driven chat support, remote diagnostics for connected bikes, and predictive maintenance reminders sent directly to users' smartphones. These enhancements not only reduced overhead but also improved customer satisfaction, a critical metric in regions where competitive alternatives were readily available. Harley's transformation thus became not just a manufacturing pivot but a wholesale redefinition of its business model and customer journey. On the regulatory front, Harley had to navigate an increasingly complex patchwork of environmental and trade compliance standards. Each country it entered brought unique legal and operational hurdles, from emission norms and safety certifications to labor regulations and tax codes. To manage this, the company established regional compliance hubs staffed with legal, environmental, and operational experts. These teams worked proactively with local governments to ensure Harley's practices met or exceeded expectations. And in many cases, Harley positioned itself as a leader in sustainable mobility practices. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Harley Davidson moving abroad? Will tariffs hurt US jobs? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time. And see you next time. And see you next time. And see you next time.